The average person who called themselves a practicing church attender maybe went, 1.4 times a month or somewhere around there. That's decreased, but also people learn sitting in their couch at home streaming, like they could flip the digital channel and realize like, man, my pastor's good, but there's these other two guys that I really kind of like listening to a lot.
Welcome to the Digital Ministry Podcast. I'm your host, Nick, and I am with Brad Hill today. Brad is the Chief Solutions Officer at Gloo. Gloo is amazing, Brad, and it's something that you and I have talked about in the past, but every time we get together, I get an update and I just hear kind of the progress that you guys have been making. I'm excited for our audience to hear a little bit about your work and what you're doing today. So thanks for being here.
No, Nick, it's great to be here. Good to hang out with you again. We've known each other for years, and I get to work with your brother. So always will take a running up on an invitation.
Shout out to Bryce. I'm trying to get him to agree to be on here. And I told him the other day, I was like, you and I should just argue for an hour and record it. And I think people would maybe enjoy it. I don't know. Or just think we're dysfunctional, but either way, it'd be entertaining. So
that would be awesome. People get to see, you guys have, you have so many similar mannerisms too. So it would be clear that there's a relation here.
Yeah. I don't have my Cardinals hat on today, but Bryce is never without it.
He reps very well. Yeah. I hope his deal is strong because he's given a lot of brand exposure.
Yeah. Well, that's what happens when you buy a new hat every season. So the Gloo. Tell us about Gloo. Tell us what it is and who are you serving?
Yeah. So the simple kind of, elevator pitch, if you will, Gloo is the trusted technology platform that exists to help connect the faith ecosystem, the Big C Church, and help release its collective might. So that's our bumper sticker, right? Barely fits on a bumper sticker. But really what that effectively means is Gloo is an exchange. We use that word platform, by the way, really intentionally, Nick. It's sometimes overused in technology. Everybody's a platform.
Sure.
When you go back to the dictionary, like a platform is really a set of infrastructures that connect things. So Uber connects drivers and riders. Airbnb connects hosts and guests. So our contention is that the whole church ecosystem is rife with producers and consumers and people that give and get and serve and are served. And then we all switch and sometimes we, reverse roles. But we lack oftentimes like connectivity between. And that shows up in a lot of ways that we have lived with for so long that we don't even think about. So Gloo exists ultimately to connect. And the last part of your question, who we serve, it is the local church, but we also have very rich, deep relationships with networks like denominations across the country, city gospel movements, church planting movements, a lot of publishers, a lot of people that make apps for Christians in the church. So all in all, we have about 71,000 registered accounts on the Gloo platform. A lot of those are churches, but there are also all those other types of orgs. And we have well over 150,000 kind of on our list. And that's really just U.S., North America is where we focus.
Okay. Yeah, great. It's a great setup. Platform, like a physical platform that you stand on, you can stand on it. You can build things on it. And there's so many different, by the way, I should say Scott Beck, founder, I don't know what his title is, but what is Scott's title? I was asking, Scott Beck, the founder of Gloo, has been preaching about platform, in the ministry context, I think earlier than anybody else that I know, and has been really intentional about that. There's so many different aspects of, products, features that you guys have out there that we could talk about. I think with digital ministry, one of the most intriguing to me and to our audience is this act of really kind of outreach, using digital media, whether it's advertising or organic, and then working to, as you reach those people, to connect them into the local church. Just talk a little bit about, what that looks like at Gloo these days.
Sure. Well, I think, a couple sobering stats and things that we point to a good bit. One is that COVID rocked everybody's world for sure. And I think we're sufficiently beyond it where we kind of look back and we see some really measurable changes. One thing I think churches learned was very quickly how to figure out streaming, whether they liked it or not. It was our only connectivity out to our people because the building was closed. We also learned that the churches that had developed a priority on relationship and community tended to be the ones that saw the least attrition. They saw the most, stickiness. And when it was time to open the building back up, that's the church that probably had the best return rate, which is a really important lesson, that actually leans into the outreach conversation, which is, man, the more that we position our local churches as a place of community and even an antidote to this loneliness epidemic that's going on out there in the US, that's a really winsome, compelling message, even if somebody's like, kind of quote, not ready for church. But we did see that pattern was churches with community fared better. What we also learned though, is like people change their patterns wildly. Like before COVID, the average person who called themselves a practicing church attender maybe went, 1.4 times a month or somewhere around there. That's decreased, but also people learn sitting in their couch at home streaming, like they could flip the digital channel and realize like, man, my pastor's good, but there's these other two guys that I really kind of like listening to a lot, or this other podcast, she's really great. And so where we get fed, challenged, grow, et cetera, much more of a buffet. And I think it calls into question, like, what's our church's job? Is our job content? Because content is now ubiquitous, versus is there maybe something additional or more that our church really can fill a void in people's lives? So anyway, that's a little bit of a setup, as we look back over these last 4 or 5 years. What we also have seen though is, and Nick, you and others have been such trailblazers in this area of digital outreach, digital missions even. People are fewer and fewer just looking online, Googling for church. It does still happen, right? There are those searches, but fewer kind of self-activate for church, if you will. But people are definitely looking for a connection, and they're definitely reaching out for help, sometimes even prayer or just community, often around something that's going on in their life. It could be a life event, could be a felt need of some type, what have you. And so what we're learning, and you and others have been on this track for quite a while, the more we can put our churches in the pathway of someone who's actively searching for a connection, in many ways, that's the most compelling way for us to see a harvest, to see traffic that we can intersect, that's intent-based. It's not creepy. We're not targeting anyone. We're just basically sitting there in the pathway of someone who's looking for a connection, saying, hey, we'd love to connect with you. No expectations, no preconceived notions. And for churches that have really been buying into that concept, the results have been outstanding, like really, really transformative in terms of where they're growing and seeing life change.
I'm curious about how often you run into pastors or maybe even denominations that are holding kind of that in-person attendance at such a high level that there's maybe a discount placed on the digital experience or that outreach or that effort. I mean, how often are you coming up against people that are just saying, I want to do this, I want to work with you, but for the purpose of, filling the pews?
Yeah. No, I mean, you were very charitable in the way you asked the question. I mean, I'll be a little more blunt. I think that many of us in our churches come out of a training and come out of even a decade or decades of ministry where it was about church growth. We were doing kind of the attractional field of dreams thing, build it, they will come. And also to be fair to our pastors, who I love and have deep respect for the incredibly hard job they have to do, they're under a lot of pressure oftentimes because the things they measure, like attendance, giving, pews that are full or empty, that's really kind of what their board looks at. That's what they get measured by, et cetera. So it's understandable that they would reach first for like, give me a solution that's going to get someone to church on Sunday. But again, as we just covered, like that's really not an effective strategy. And in fact, if you buy into any number of surveys that are out there, even the pastor that sees quote unquote church growth today, best we can find, on average, about 80% of church growth is really just transfer growth. That's someone coming from the church down the street. And so collectively zooming out, with that strategy, we're not winning. Like we're not successfully even recycling ourselves, let alone reaching new people. So almost mathematically, there has to be a different approach. And, but to your question, we do still encounter quite a large percentage of pastors that I think need, that they need the training and need the equipping and need sometimes even just the inspiration to hear like, hey, it's okay if you just take someone to coffee. And it's okay if you pray with someone over text without a guarantee that they're going to show up Sunday or that they're going to become an active giver leader. Now, what we also find, this is kind of the encouraging part, is when you do invest and serve in people's lives, you build trust. Turns out many times, not all the time, no guarantees, but many times you do earn the right then to like advance and nurture that relationship into something that maybe looks like engagement in a community or an ongoing relationship. But that motivation has to be pure at first for that trust to get built.
Jay Cranda is a guy that I think you know. He is the online campus pastor at Saddleback Hughes Church in California. And one of the things I love about Jay is that he sets a really high bar for his team, a high quality bar. And so if they have an hour-long sermon that's live streamed, they don't count attendance. I mean, you can see all this digitally. You can see how many people are watching at any given time. But they only count an attendance as somebody who, and forgive me, Jay, for misquoting this, but it's directionally correct. It's like if they were there 80% of the time, so like out of 60 minutes, if they watched 80% and stayed active for that long. And I think that, there's a parallel to that for what the church has looked at for growth metrics, which you're talking about. If somebody's like giving and attending and serving or in a community group, like any combination of two of those things, then you're good. I think there's an opportunity to raise the bar across the board and understand what's the quality of some of these interactions rather than just counting, bodies in the seat or people in attendance at a group. I'll give you an example. I was having breakfast with a guy, a buddy of mine locally a couple weeks ago, and he said, we got onto this, he's a community group leader, and he was saying the person that he kind of reports to on the church staff is called the other day and was like, hey, I've seen the last several weeks, there's only like 2 people that are showing up. And he was just kind of exacerbated. He was like, it was actually a good thing that nobody else came because those 2 people, we needed to have a smaller, private conversation about what they're struggling with and working through. And they weren't going to do that in a room of like 12 or 14 guys. And he was just kind of disappointed that there wasn't kind of an acknowledgement of the ministry that was happening in his living room, because it didn't match the profile of what the church considered good.
Right.
And you've got, I think, an interesting perspective because you're working with tens of thousands of churches across the country. What's your reaction to that? And if you agree that our church growth metrics that we've used for decades are incorrect, like what's a better model?
Well, yeah, that's a softball question, Nick, and something we're really excited to talk about. Because we do, I mean, spoiler, I would say we do believe that while it's important to count attendance and budgets, by the way, both those metrics and other church growth metrics do show up in the New Testament. We see it in Acts 2, et cetera. So don't hear me that I'm saying like stop counting those things. Right. But we also believe that the Great Commission tells us to go therefore and make disciples. And for anyone who cares to measure and be a data informed leader and understand if we're actually doing it, how do you measure that we're making disciples? Like, how do you measure growth in people? And you don't get there just by activity metrics necessarily, but for so long, that's kind of what we've had. What's encouraging is, so we have a saying here at Gloo that points back to just what we believe God's wired into each of us, and that is relationship catalyzes growth. Actually, your story just highlighted that, where it's like, hey, we needed to be like close in, life on life with these two people for a minute. That's what was needed. We see that kind of modeled in how Jesus did most of his ministry. He spoke to large crowds a little bit, but most of it was with 12, or a small group. And so that relational context is sort of the core interaction. How do we do that at scale? And how do we know that that's actually creating flourishing in our people? So from a measurement standpoint, what we've been working on now for 5 years or so, heavily with the Barna group, by the way, is a new scoreboard for ministry. Really, it's a framework called the 5 dimensions of human flourishing, as well as the 15 dimensions of a thriving church. And there's a set of assessments behind this, believe it or not. So we've had already about 30,000 churches, at least one time or more, take a pulse of their people. And literally as a pastor, as you do this, let your people answer some questions. Questions, for example, would be things like, the Bible has authority over my life, scale of 1 to 10, agree, disagree. Or I'm satisfied with the purpose in my life. Those sorts of questions. So there's a quick subset of those. You go through them, you're going to get back a result of these 5 dimensions of your life. It's spiritual, relationships, finances, vocation, and health or well-being. And so based on that, you as an individual get to see kind of maybe, and everybody loves to like take personality tests and quizzes, right? So it's usually a pretty good initial read, but man, think of as a pastor, even anonymously across your congregation, to be able to see, hey, our people are doing pretty well in spiritual dimension, but the relationships are struggling. And if you knew that, would that impact maybe some of your priorities you set for ministry? Also, if you could take that same sample in the community outside your church, like in your city, in your neighborhood, one pastor said, this is almost like exegeting my community. And now I feel like I know, like where the real strengths and gaps and struggles are. And that helps me as a leader equip my people so I can send them out and really speak into those lives. So we're deeply excited about this idea of measuring what matters in ministry. That's kind of our tagline. And later this year, we haven't announced it yet. Happy to talk about it here, but we're going to be remounting a big effort with Barna called the State of the Church 2025. And the vision would be that we could see as many as 100,000 churches at least taking a pulse of their people to know how they're doing. And what we'd love to do then is compare that to people who are not yet in a gospel community or are not yet journeying with some Jesus follower, to be able to see empirically that this works. That and by the way, there's not just Barna, but Harvard and others have studied this. And we can prove empirically now that when someone is flourishing spiritually, the other four dials in their life also improve, which is really encouraging for the world to hear.
Yeah. Well, I think, the world has moved so much toward isolation. And I mean, you mentioned a loneliness epidemic. To understand how to combat that, I think would be just an incredible tool for churches to have, at their disposal. I'd love to know how people can participate, in that. Probably when it comes out, I guess, that'll be made known and people can survey or participate in that survey. Because we do pulse surveys all the time at my church, and how you structure those questions and what you're asking really is the starting point for shaping, the quality of the data that you're going to get back. Ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer, and, it can lead you down the wrong path. So happy to hear that that's coming. That's exciting.
That's right. No, you're spot on. And we've also worked hard, Nick, and a lot of credit to Barna for this, that, like you said, the way you ask the questions and even the terminology, especially when you get into measuring the health or the thriving of a church, turns out words matter. And even if you go from faith tradition to faith tradition or denomination to denomination, people like to call stuff different things. And that I'll call it that beautiful tapestry that we have across the church is also part of why it's been really difficult and elusive for us to have a common way to kind of know how our people are doing across the board. So a lot of the terminology in these questions and then the measurement choose words that are broad enough that everybody can find a home, whether you're Reformed, Armenian, non-denominational, mainline, whatever. So it's a really broad participation across, a whole spectrum of faith traditions in the Christian church.
That's awesome. Tell me a little bit about how you all look at the bridge between kind of online engagement and connecting people to a church locally. I would say probably in the best case. I'm sure that doesn't happen, all the time across the board. But how do you approach that? And what are some of the main kind of ideas that you're working with pastors on around that idea these days?
Yeah. Well, I think playing off of our earlier topic, connecting a person to a church, although I certainly have used that language and others have too. I catch myself because I don't think we actually connect someone to the church in the institutional sense. We're always connecting someone to someone.
There you go.
So we often use the term responder, right? And it's like, I'm going to take this person online, and we call that person an explorer, and we have them respond to an ad, or they may have searched in Google. Something brought them here, and based on what we know, and they volunteer typically some very simple details through a form or through social media, and based on what we know from that, Gloo does have a relatively robust and growing what we call match service. And it was built for this job, right? To take a person and try to match them to the next best step. What's also true of a lot of churches is they do have a weekend experience, but many churches have programs or they have sub-communities that are based around life events or life stage or affinity, right? So you might have a MomCo MOPS group. You might have a grief share or a celebrate recovery type of ministry. I know Jay, for example, has done some great work around getting people connected into Celebrate Recovery. Also a legacy from Saddleback. So what we look at is, rather than just connect them to like XYZ church down the street, if the person came in and they've signaled that they maybe are on a recovery journey or are looking for a community around being a new mom or being a new mover, we're going to try to look for the best responder or maybe group, could be an alpha group that seems like it's the best place to land them. And then we're going to make that connection. And our job at Gloo is just that. It's to make that connection to someone that's previously signaled, I want those connections. My catcher's mitt is out. And when we send that person over it's truly a handoff. We're like, hey, you're called and you're in the business of being in ministry. We've got a connection for you. Here's everything you need to know about them. And then we typically try to do as much training and equipping as we can, because across now 360,000 or so of these connections here in the US, from data, we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so that can help us increase that response rate ultimately that responder gets. And really then, like I said earlier, earn the right for them to get into a relationship.
I really appreciate that distinction. And, connect them to a church is a little bit shorthand. Your clarification is excellent. Connecting them to a responder, to a person, I think is critical. We're talking a little bit about these models. So, and the church growth model in the US that was really established, I'd say, I mean, I am not an expert on this. I know that there are people in your circle that they built a career about this. But I'd say late 80s through the 90s, it was a lot's been written about Saddleback, for example, just to kind of double click on them. A suburban environment. It's not urban. It's on the outskirts of, metro areas, creating an attractive place for people to come to church, participate in some of those programs, raise a family. That model was really distilled and I think rolled out because it was being requested by churches across the country. Like, what are you guys doing? And so that's a really good thing. It's, sharing best practices, what's having success for us. And there's so many people whose lives have been changed by those ministries. But if we've said that society's has shifted, it seems to me like Gloo's in a position to not only define what that new model is, but to really promote it. And I don't hear you saying that you have it all figured out yet, but you're working towards it, which is encouraging. What do you think it takes in order to kind of propagate, a new model for church that's been updated given the social media tools, the digital lives that people are leading today, and also some of the problems that come with, these devices that we carry around in our pockets? I mean, there's also a lot that's been written about, the harms of social media and how it's made people more isolated. So, like, if you strike upon, a new, better way to reach people, to make disciples, have you thought at all about what it takes in order to really kind of roll that out and present that to the market? If we consider, church leaders, pastors, committees, boards, the market.
Yeah, no, I love the question, Nick. By the way, having spent a lot of my career, building and kind of seeing out over a lot of what I'll now call legacy technologies for churches, databases and kids check-in and mobile apps and online giving and all those tools that totally feed into that model, that mega church model, et cetera, that we've come through these last decades. There's still a great place for corporate worship, that experience. Churches are creating great content, right? So we're not certainly sitting here saying burn it all down, let's change. But what we are just pointing to is that what worked 10 years ago, what worked 20, 25 years ago is not producing the same result. It's just math. So we do see an opportunity here. And quite honestly, I think sometimes to look for what's new, you go back and look at what's old. And some of the New Testament models are built around that idea of we're built for relationship. God's wired us that way. We are a body. And the churches we've built over, especially the last 20 to 50 years here in the US, are this full stack, one-stop shop for everything, so to speak. And that's great for those who have been able to pull that off, but we don't often see that as much in New Testament descriptions that we can find. Instead, you're an eye, I'm an ear, someone else is a right hand. And so when I said earlier about Gloo's mission, helping to release the collective might of the church, Literally, all we're saying there is God has put so much abundant resource out in his kingdom, in the local church, but also in churches that are a mile apart from each other, who may have slightly different capabilities and competencies. Churches historically don't always partner that well together, but they might well be able to cover each other's blind spots, right? And then mental health is a great example of a category we've been spending a lot of time on. I think so many pastors are feeling, not only themselves, but even just among their flock, that weight of anxiety, depression, loneliness, et cetera. But they also would say, like, I wasn't trained for this. I don't know what to say in this chat window right now to someone who's expressing maybe a mental health struggle. I wish I could have someone like whispering in my ear right now who knows what to do. And so at Gloo, we have a great partnership, just in this one example, with the American Association of Christian Counselors, AACC. They've got tremendous content that's designed to be deployed through a church, but many churches don't know about it. So on Gloo, as an example, you're texting with that Explorer. They say something back like, my chest feels heavy. I think I might have anxiety. I don't know what to do. You're not trained for this, but there might be a little snippet that you can use from a ministry partner in that moment. It's free. You can grab it, use it. That's the body being the body just in that moment. It's a small example, but when you ask Nick about like a new way to do ministry, even in that small example, there's a little bit of humility and openness that's required there to say, you know, like, hey, I desperately want to serve this person where they're at. I care about them. I love them because they're an image bearer and I don't know what to do. And I think there's someone else who does, and I'm going to reach for that help, you know, and be glad to do it. So we see that same pattern emerging in so many churches, and I could tell story after story, you know, of new churches, church plants. I mean, I was talking to a church planter in South Florida recently who literally built his entire church just off of Gloo Explorers that he received. Because he was like, we didn't have a lot of seed money. Our launch budget was small. We saw this thing with people every day coming off of the internet that needed help. We're like, that sounds great to us. They're receiving them, and then they're actually training them to then be responders to the next Explorer. It's like, what a beautiful platform model right there of, you know, turning someone who's been comforted into a comforter for the next person. So that to us looks like the model for maybe what's gonna turn some tides on church numbers, and also just maybe reverse some perceptions of what people think about the institutional church.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it is a beautiful example, you know, because you mentioned the Great Commission earlier, you know, so that's Matthew 28:19 says, go and make disciples, teaching them to obey, baptizing them, you know, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There, we got some scripture into the podcast. I think for so many years, for centuries, really, we've looked at the go. Like the go was the hard part, you know. Now, I don't think going is as hard as it used to be. You know, we still have to kind of get out there to engage with people, do the work of ministry. But it feels like that South Florida church that you're talking about has shifted the emphasis of the Great Commission to the making disciples. You know, so if people are really being trained first, you know, reached, engaged, finding forgiveness, freedom, salvation in Christ, and then being equipped to go and reach others. I mean, that is a beautiful thing. That's exciting to hear.
It is. And what you have there in the leader, his name's Mike, is he's sort of shifted, I would say, from a mindset of what I call content to community or content to connection. In other words, like our church's main value isn't preaching the sermon on Sunday morning. We do that, but our church's main value is connecting with people, loving them as Jesus would, but then also really importantly, like training and multiplying them to go do that for the next. And another church in Fort Worth, they would say they have a hospital church culture. His phrase was, "There's no one we can't help." And by virtue of that, for the marketer nerds in the audience, that Fort Worth church has more than a double response rate to our average on Gloo. They see, I think, fully like 92, 93% of any explorer we send them, they get into an engaged relationship, which is like, where do you ever see that in a marketing funnel? But and they're using the exact same tools that every other church is using, but it's really about the mindset and the heart on the other end. So that to us is the work, for us to really decide, like, man, do we want to be about connecting? Because if so, there's a lot of people out there that want to connect right now.
Well, I'll highlight what you didn't say there, which is you got a 46% response rate on average, which I'm really encouraged by. Like that's
not too shabby. Right.
Yeah. That's really good. It's higher than I thought it would have been. But to see that doubling up to the low 90s, that's amazing. So what would they attribute that to then?
Even before we got engaged with them at Gloo, they were doing what they call freedom groups. Their pastors got a great story around addiction recovery. They've got a special curriculum. They have developed a heart for victims of sexual abuse. So just people on all kinds of journeys find a home there, free of judgment, free of any kind of stipulations. They're going to hear big T truth. They're going to hear the gospel straight up. But they have, it's kind of one of those no perfect people rules congregation. And so you can see like how God was preparing them so well to then just add a digital stream of inbounds to what they were already doing. And it's just plugged in so beautifully. So actually some of their curriculum, especially on the sexual abuse, which by the way is a conversation that churches desperately need to get better at having. That church is not only responder on Gloo, but that content is now finding its way into what we call the Discover Marketplace. It's another part of Gloo where we've got a large and growing library of resources, content. That's where ultimately we hope a lot of churches and leaders of all types can find great training and, level up type materials to help them lean into ministry.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that like nothing is hidden anymore. And if it is today, it won't be tomorrow. There's hypocrisy is the big critique, of Christians. And we talked about this a little bit before we started just privately, but I'll mention it now. There's so many people that are not considering church or Christians as a place to turn to because of, all of the bad stories that are very public today. It's really easy to see how bad news gains more traction than good news, and so when you've got these moral failures, somebody's preaching against it, but then they have a moral failure, that unfortunately gets labeled across the entire church and everybody gets painted with the same brush. I think what you're describing is an open, honest conversation. It's relatable, and people that are struggling as victims of abuse are finding a place that's really kind of a safe place, which goes back to this whole idea of, making it about your audience, not making it about you. It's what needs exist within the population that we're trying to serve and how do we best serve them.
That's right.
I think Gloo is surfacing what those needs are within individual communities, which is just very exciting. What do you see? What does that look like in the next few years with, even artificial intelligence, being able to surface some of those kind of underlying needs that might not be immediately visible, but are certainly there if you listen for the right signals?
Yeah, I think, like any proper marketer, we see a lot of data. We like to help the data guide our thinking a little bit. And yeah, certainly, Nick, AI has just opened up so many new possibilities for both knowing, rapidly adjusting, and also better matching, right? So on the previous example where we've got an explorer that asks to connect and we try to find them the best possible match, we do see some volume daily of folks that have a real critical, like imminent self-harm, suicidal ideation. And previously, when we had humans doing a lot of the triage, it would take a matter of hours to make a match. And those are hours you don't have in a case like that. AI has come in and really helped improve the engine to now we're able to route that person in milliseconds to not maybe a church, but more to a suicide prevention ministry that's equipped for that. So we're really heartened by that very fruitful use of AI technology, to the tune of, I think we've had over 8,000 of those folks now routed to ministries like Death to Life and others that are doing such a great job in the Lord's name. But the other thing that's so interesting is the data that's thrown off from this whole system, right? And it is collectively helping us know our audience better. And even, we talk about like A/B testing a lot in marketing, or split testing, the speed at which we can test things out and know what's working is increasing. We also saw a gap where a lot of churches run social media, and we think that's great. And that, in my view, that should be a part of almost every church's strategy, go where the fish are, so to speak. But when a church runs a social media ad, whether it's Saddleback, huge church, or small church plant in nowhere, America, they're typically running that ad under the church's brand, and which is normal and fine. But it's like you're kind of like running an ad for your business, so to speak. And in the marketplace, in secular world, we see that all the time, but we also see something called cooperative advertising. Like growing up Saturday morning cartoons, we'd all see like there's one to grow on, sponsored by the Ad Council, or the most famous of all is Got Milk, which is really just a cooperative campaign from a bunch of dairy farmers that couldn't afford to run big national ads, right? So we have over the last few years effectively established a cooperative ad model for the local church, and it's a brand called Church's Care, and it allows us to do some stuff that a local church couldn't do, and it also helps us put lines in the water that maybe an average church couldn't. So it earns us the right to get into certain places. We have scale to see economies and efficiencies in certain ways. And it also gives us a lot of aggregate data. And what we're trying to do at Gloo is any learnings we get from a cooperative ad campaign, we want to surface those right back to the churches that might use that data in their own ads too. So it's a rising tide. But this idea of like having an ad council for the church has been kind of a fun thing to stand up. And since then, we've stood up a few other brands like it. We're active on TikTok now, and we've got a number of other things running that are for the service of the whole church rather than just any one individual congregation.
Yeah, great. So, if a pastor or a ministry leader is listening to this and they're wondering, you guys are very sophisticated, way out in front on these topics. Like what are the one or two things that you hope that ministry leaders would take away from either this conversation or Gloo's experience? Like, what do they need to be thinking about?
Well, I think, one place I'd start, just to kind of recap where we covered earlier, is realize that your church's main job is to equip the relationship. And that's true whether it's like the congregation you have in their own family, marriages, those kind of relationships, yes, but also equipping them to do relational ministry in their context, places that you as a pastor are never going to be. But I think it also extends to the way you do your marketing. And that is to say, some people will respond to a come to our church type of message, but we think in 2024, a lot more people might respond to, hey, what's going on in your world? I feel like I can help. Is tomorrow a good time to talk by phone, or do you want to grab coffee? Like that kind of mindset we're finding over and over again is, far more effective and, quite honestly, more winsome to many. Real practically, we would definitely encourage and invite every church to have an account on Gloo. That is kind of where this connected ministry movement and all these partners are kind of congregating, and it's free. You can come in, have an account there, tons of resources. Also, kind of a cool true fact is every church with a free account also gets free access to our texting service, which is like a whole other conversation. But we have that for a specific reason, because what we've learned is that more than email, more than mobile apps, social media, texting in the US anyway, is like by far the most effective way to communicate and engage with people for any purpose, but especially in ministry. So we've been successfly able to have just some great kingdom-minded donors and other sponsors say, hey, we want every church to have this. So if there was no other reason to get an account on Gloo, it's like, get the texting. That's a great reason to come in. And then from there, you can expand and do all kinds of stuff on the platform. And we're slowly chipping away. Like you said, Nick, we don't have nearly, half of it figured out. But the idea of connected ministry and helping the whole church release our collective might means more people to minister to, better engagement with the people that we are discipling. It means knowing more about our people, like being a better informed leader, which means less guesswork. And also we're unlocking new ways to get funding in churches and ministries. Turns out donors like it when you can show outcomes and you can show all these impact measures. So that's all kind of part of what's happening on the platform.
That's awesome, man. Thanks for sharing. Like I said, I'll kind of wrap it up where I began. Every time we talk, I learn so much from you and from your team. So thanks for sharing and being generous with us today. I think it'd be great if you're up for it, maybe come back later in the year. Like, we're still early in 2024. So, I mean, I'd love to see how that progresses, and especially the work that you're doing with Barna. That's really exciting. I'll be watching for that.
Yeah, we'd love to, Nick. We're going to have, I think, some pretty cool research on topics ranging from what does the culture think of the church now, the state of next gen, and we're also doing a lot of ongoing work. You mentioned AI earlier, researching AI and pastors. We just released some stuff on AI and parents. So we're excited to get all that knowledge in leaders' hands. Love to come back anytime.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Brad, for spending some time with me today, and wish you all the best.
Thanks, Nick.